So, colleagues, good morning. I can see there's still a few participants joining. Welcome to all of you who are joining from different parts of the world. If you've joined, it's because you're curious about this big picture question, which is, what does the global future hold? And we, as the International Resources Panel Secretariat, decided that it was a good opportunity right now in 2021, almost halfway through, and almost 1.5 years after COVID, to ask that big picture question: what does the global future hold? And we're also asking it so that we can inform the work of the IRP. In particular, for those of you who are very intimately familiar with our work, we want to be able to inform the future scenario modeling work. And for those of you who know how scenarios and modeling works, you have to be able to ask questions, make assumptions. And we want to get as many ideas from you, our colleagues, our experts in academia, our experts in civil society, our experts in government, etc. So this is the first series, and this particular topic is going to focus on urbanization and cities. And as you know, there's going to be more topics coming forward, but I will give my colleague Ainoa at the end of this an opportunity to inform all of you what the next topics will be. So for this particular topic on urbanization and cities, why did we choose it? We obviously have chosen it for the reason that Wolfgang Lutz, Professor Wolfgang Lutz, and Professor Martin Heyer will tell us that the rapid urbanization across the world is something that the IRP needs to be aware of, but it's also something that is about it answers the question, what does the global future look like? For those of you who are not familiar with who I am, my name's Merlin van Voeren. I'm the head of the International Resources Panel Secretariat. Very briefly, you know that we were set up by governments, and we are hosted by UNEP, the UN Environmental Programme, and we have our office in New York. I'm saying New York because I'm in New York quite at the moment, but actually we have our offices in Paris. And you know that we deal with eminent scientists and researchers, and we also work closely with our governing body, which we call our steering committee, which is made of governments from around the world. So that's just a quick introduction in terms of who I am. I also want to say that for those of you who have followed our flagship product, which is the Global Resources Outlook, we are now doing the scoping and the initial laying the foundations for GRO, as we call it, Global Resources Outlook, for 2023. And we want to be able to make sure, as the IRP, we are asking the right questions, we have the right information, we have the data to be able to do the modeling, that we can say this is what the future looks like in terms of how the world manages its global resources. And also, are there things that we as the IRP need to be able to tell the world when we publish this particular publication? So, like I said, we have two speakers. I'm going to give over to Professor Wolfgang Lutz, who is from Vienna. He's the director of the Wittgenstein Centre for Demography and Global Human Capital. He is probably, certainly in my view, one of the most eminent thinkers of where things are going in terms of population, in terms of demography, and Professor Wolfgang Lutz, I'm going to give over to you. You have between 20 and 30 minutes. We will open for a Q&A. For those of you who are following us, the Q&A you can put through the chat. We have a colleague who will monitor the chat and will allow that colleague at the end of Professor Wolfgang Lutz's presentation to pose some questions. So over to you in Vienna, and welcome.
Good morning to everybody from Vienna. My name is Wolfgang Lutz. As was said, I will now try to share my screen with you. Let's see how it works. Can you see the screen now? Yes.
Yes.
Okay, let's see whether it still goes full screen. Yes, here we go. Okay, I'm a demographer, as was said, and I'm going to talk to you today about what I call the power of multi-dimensional demography. And in particularly, as was said, there's a lot of talking also about the changing composition by place of residence, urban and rural. But in demography, we usually look at the size of the population, the age structure, the gender distribution. And today I will also focus on a specific aspect that is, according to my own analysis and that of many of my colleagues, is really also extremely important for our future, and that's the changing education distribution of the population as it relates to sustainable development. So demographers have long been looking at the changing size of the population. That has been the origin of our discipline. But then already early in the 20th century, when it was clear that age structures are rather irregular after World War I in Europe, so there were some very big age groups followed by small age groups which were decimated through to birth rate declines or losses in war. So the changing age composition, as well as the gender differentiation, became constituent parts of demography. But there are several other characteristics of individual, like where we live, the urban-rural place of residence, our level of education, labor force participation. So typically, if you conduct a survey, and there's always a box that's called demographics, and sort of the characteristics of the individuals that are registered there, that's what we deal with in demography. So it is defined as the scientific study of changing population size and structures. And I should point out, it's not just the age structure in plural, it's multiple structures. What are demographic dimensions? As I said, these are usually characteristics as demographics, which also in the context of migration, they include place of birth, ethnicity. In the US, race is an important variable. So everything that is a characteristic of people and that is fairly stable, that doesn't change from one day to the next, but something that you carry with you through most of your life. Now, here we see what is sort of the typical way of depicting population change. It's the age pyramid. So you have people sorted by age, the youngest one at the bottom and the older one on the top. And then we usually have women to the right and men to the left. And in a developing country context where you have relatively high birth rate, this does indeed look like a pyramid. You see here the Korea example for 1970, where the birth rate was still high. And what we do now is not just the age and sex, but we added color, which is the highest educational attainment. So as you see for Korea, even, which is one of the richest countries in the world today and one of the most educated, you see still that there in dark red, these are women predominantly, but also some men in 1970 above the age of 35 and 40 who have never had the opportunity to go to school. So there's just no formal education whatsoever. That's the dark red. Then the yellow is primary education, the light blue is secondary, and the dark blue tertiary. You see in 1970 only very few younger men had some post-secondary education in Korea. But why are we so certain about modeling these demographic trends? and also projecting them for many decades into the future, it is that there is stability along cohort lines. Like here, this shows you now 4 age pyramids going in steps of 20 years. And so that the group of people who were 15 to 20-year-old in 1970, they are 20 years older in 1990, 35 to 40, and then again 20 years older. And typically after a certain age, after age 25, and so your educational attainment doesn't change anymore. Some people are still getting more education, like in this case, some tertiary education. But this is sort of once we know how many babies are born in one birth cohort, we have a good handle for how many 60-year-old people we will have 60 years later. It's only that the mortality and the migration that can modify these numbers. And since the human life is rather long in most countries now, around 70 or even more years, that is why we have a stable basis for going decades into the future. And what you see here is for Korea, that was a country that has one of the world's most rapid education expansions, together with Singapore, that I'm also going to show you. You see that it was then really in the 1990s that only the education expanded significantly, that all the young people got some secondary education. 2010, already Korea is very highly educated. It has more than half of young people with post-secondary education, already one of the best educated countries in the world. But still, if you look at the older age groups, you have some dark red there. These are still the women who are now above the age of 75. But when they were at school age, Korea was still a poor developing country, and they didn't have much opportunity for schooling them. So you have this very slow turnover of generations. There's also a word we call it demographic metabolism. So as the younger generations who are different, and in this case better educated, slowly moving up the age pyramid, and that allows you also then to go to 2030 and projections into the future. Now, this is just a general concept, and since you are interested in how doing scenarios, in that sense, demography is quite clear, because we only have sort of 3 factors that determine the future size of the population. It's fertility, mortality, and migration. So let me show you here on the left-hand side, you have in a stylistic way sort of the population by age, sex, and education of any country in the year 2000, and then you want to project it over to the year 2005. So what you do, you just move the whole pyramid 1 step up, 1 5-year step up. Everybody over 5 years gets 5 years older, and typically maintains the characteristics such as the education distribution, which is the color here. Well, some people are going to die between 2000 and 2005. You see on these green arrows there on the top, that's the mortality. So we are applying age and gender specific mortality rates, and if we further differentiate by education or urbanization, they're also specific for the education or place of residence groups. So there are some people going to die, and we have information, but we have to assume what are the mortality rates of the future. And then, of course, if we move it up by 1 step, the lowest age group 0 to 4 is empty, unless it is filled with birth. So that is the place where there will be age-specific fertility rates assumed for these different groups of women by level of education. Fertility tends to differ. But applying these fertility rates to the number of women over the period 2000 to 2005 gives you then the births that are in the youngest age group. And then, of course, there over these 5 years, some in and out migration is going to take place, and that will change the pattern. And if we have this multidimensional like education, there can also be education transitions, people who finish their highest degree between 2000 and 2005. But there are just 3, or if we have education, 4 ways of transition. So it gets manageable, and we have to make assumptions on these forces of change. Just to illustrate this again, in Singapore, how a sort of demographic metabolism is life. This was Singapore in 1970. You see, today the richest and best educated country in the world was a poor developing country still in 1970. You see, only the younger generations had started with some primary and secondary education. Again, the older women largely completely without formal education. But as we go on to 1980, this is the education really picks up. 1990, now even the tertiary educated young men and women come into the main working ages. And this, by the way, is the time when Singapore has seen this spectacular economic growth together with Korea and Taiwan, the Asian tigers. And this has really been associated with this better educated cohorts coming into the workforce. And then you see also the birth rate as a consequence of female education. The birth rate has come down and the pyramid is much lower, much more narrow at the bottom. And we go on 2000, you see education is further expanding. 2010, this really is the best educated young population in the world, where almost 3/4 have a tertiary education. But still you have this in red, this uneducated older, particularly women, because again, this is the cohort effect. When they were young, they didn't have a chance for education. And so we can go into the future and project this step by step. Now let's just look at India. Here we have India in the 2010. You see red, as India has had left sort of a third of the population without any formal education. And again, you see it's many more women that are uneducated than men. But particularly in the recent years, there have been important progress in also increasing school enrollment in rural areas. And here, this is our medium scenario for India in 2060. You see the fertility will be lower. The population will be aging. There will be more old people than young people. And increasingly, the population will also be better educated. But it really sort of depends on the assumptions you make about how this future age pyramid will look like. So we used many of these reconstructions also to resolve a long-standing economic puzzle. Sort of theory predicted that yes, education, human capital should be one of the main drivers of economic growth, but the people used a very crude indicator, only the mean years of schooling. As soon as we had this differentiated by age and education group, we could indeed show that human capital is a key driver of economic growth. And as you see on the right-hand side, we also showed that universal primary education is not enough. It requires also broad-based secondary education to bring poor countries out of poverty. And fortunately now the 2015 Sustainable Development Goals have a clear focus on quality primary and secondary education for both girls and boys. Now, as to mortality, we don't have much time, but again, there's a lot of evidence that indeed education is the single most important determinant of health and declining mortality. On the left-hand side, you've seen what has become famous as the Preston curve, plotting GDP on the horizontal axis against life expectancy on the vertical axis. And you see that it's flattening the effect. So at a higher level of income, the income buys you less of an additional life expectancy. And also the curve has shifted over the years. And people have attributed this upward shift to medical progress. So like in 2010, the same income bought you more life expectancy than in 1970. But that's if you leave, like many people do, from the assumption that it's really GDP that drives health. But our hypothesis here in this paper was, no, it's actually education that drives. And you see here two strong arguments. The first, with mean years of schooling on the horizontal axis, the relationship is much more linear. So it's still at high levels of education. This still brings you higher life expectancy. It does not level off. And secondly, there's almost no shift upward. So the education can really explain these gains much better. If you want, we can discuss later, but we don't have time now. A similar effect for fertility in almost every country, particularly in the developing countries that are still going through a process of demographic transition. Women with low education, you see this dark red here, they have between 6, 7, 8 children per woman, whereas in the same country, even the more educated women have much lower fertility, around 2. So it has been shown over and over again, of course, that together with access to reproductive health facilities, female education really is the key driver of bringing down high fertility rates. So what is it in education? It's not just the socioeconomic status and something assigned to you. Again, we don't have time, and much has been written about this. True effect of education changing our brains, changing the way we think towards a more rational, longer term view to the future, less risky behavior, and a fast ability to learn from past damage. So in this respect, we are making the point that really it's worthwhile always not just to have the population by age, sex, and then also Martin will talk about the place of residence, urban, rural, but also the social stratification, if you want, that is also a cognitive stratification by level of education. Okay, we had shown that in kid education really makes a difference also for the population projections itself. We had this review article there in Science some time ago, assuming the same education-specific fertility rates, but one very pessimistic education scenario, constant enrollment numbers, so no new schools being built. And then you see the world population quickly increasing to already about 10 billion by mid-century. And or if we have the most optimistic, the fast-track education expansion, that sort of every country would start now following the path of Singapore or Korea, then already by mid-century we have 1 billion people fewer, and you see the blue area expanding, even if we assume the same education-specific fertility rates. Now, finally, putting this into the context of global environmental change, we had several papers. Here, this one is in Nature Climate Change, where we show that the human population, and that's what also in resource use you will probably primarily focus on, is it's through the consumption that we either deplete resources or we emit greenhouse gases that will then cause global climate change. It is, of course, also us, the human beings, who through innovation change technologies, not only behavior, but also possibly greener technologies that can help to mitigate the greenhouse gases. So in a way, this is the contribution of population size, but also distribution and also the human capital that enables us for mitigative action. But what is equally important is the differential vulnerability to already unavoidable climate change, or more generally a sort of resource depletion. There we have some adaptive capacity, and not every human being in every location is equally affected by these environmental changes. So it's very important to also sort of model the feedback, how this environmental change, which we are studying, will likely impact on future human well-being, affecting the health, affecting the livelihood, and also migration as an important intervening variable that is in a way an adaptive strategy if people have to move away from one place where they cannot live anymore. So there is in a way full circle. We, the human beings, are the ones who are causing the problems, who can also be active in the mitigative action, but then we are differentially vulnerable, and in demographic differential, also by age, gender, women are differentially vulnerable than men, and also the less educated typically are more vulnerable than the more educated. And this has given rise to this framework of the shared socioeconomic pathways that has become a scenario modeling framework in much of the climate change community, where sort of we've been producing what I call the human core of the SSPs, of the shared socioeconomic pathways, where on the one axis you have the socioeconomic challenges for adaptation, and on the other the socioeconomic challenges for mitigation. And then you have sort of the SSP2 is in the middle of the road scenario. SSP1 in demographic terms, we have low fertility, we have low mortality, and sort of a stable migration pattern. And then on the SSP3 side, this is the stalled development, where we have still high fertility, high mortality, and low education. Okay, now let's look at a few numbers. These are our projections of the world population, sort of the median of the middle of the road, SSP2 population increasing to somewhat less than 10 billion. Here we are a bit lower than the UN population projections, because we believe that female education in Africa will bring fertility down a little faster than the UN assumes. And also in East Asia, fertility will fall to lower levels. We see now in Korea, fertility, for instance, well below 1.0 children per woman, whereas other projections like the UN assume it in China, so it will never fall below 1.6 and then slightly recover. So this we don't know what the long-term future will bring, but whatever you assume will also be reflected in different world population projections. But here you see also that there is almost certainly a further expansion in the educational level of the world population, because young people in every country of the world today tend to be better educated than the older people. And as they move up the age pyramid, there is a huge momentum in this education expansion. So here you see some other scenarios. The SSP1 is the rapid development scenario. You see the world population will level off even earlier, and you will have a much better educated population during the second half. But this is not guaranteed. You can have the SSP3, the stalled development scenario, where you have the world population going up above 12 billion even, and you have not really much of an education expansion. You actually have an expansion of the less educated groups. So this is already including the above mentioned momentum, but in particularly some big countries such as Nigeria or in Pakistan, it's not really clear, or Ethiopia. These are countries that are just on the crossroads, whether they enter sort of a vicious circle of rapid population growth and not progressing education, or whether they can move to the winning side. I mentioned Nigeria. This is really sort of two, given what today's population in 2020 is, the SSP1 shows Nigeria essentially moving in the direction of a European country in terms of their education distribution. That comes together with all the other benefits of human capital, at least by middle of century. But this is not guaranteed. If Boko Haram get their way, and if the schooling system does not progress in Nigeria, the population will continue to grow very rapidly. The education expansion will be stalled, and you may have up to almost 1 billion Nigerians, an incredible number, and very poorly educated on average. So this is not a very good future for the country. Just to let you know, we have a website of the Wittgenstein Centre. You just Google Wittgenstein Centre, Human Capital Explorer, and you, for every country in the world, you can have sort of moving age pyramids. Let me just here illustrate with this screenshot the population pyramids for Africa, for the whole continent that we had in 1975. You sort of 3/4 uneducated, never been to school. And then on the other hand, we see Africa in 2075, where the population is much bigger. Of course, in 75, it was less than 500 million. Now it's going to be above 2.5 billion, but hopefully also much better educated, with fertility rate declining and a more aging population pyramid with much higher human capital. But you can also choose different scenarios, and you will get for every country and for every continent here different scenarios, and you can download these pictures at the bottom. You can also go to another mode where you get numerical data on all of this. This is just for your information that we've done these scenarios by age, sex, and education for all countries in the world. Just another example here. This is Africa under the rapid development scenario. Now there you see indeed an extreme, but this is already sort of middle of the 2075. It's very far into the future, and you see that theoretically, for this very optimistic, if most African countries would now start doing what Korea and Singapore did in the 1970s, a massive expansion of the education, you could end up in this pyramid. But on the other side, if it's more stalled development, you could end up with this population. And you also see the size is very different. In the left-hand side is a population of only 2 billion, where it's almost 4 billion in Africa alone under the stalled development scenario. Now, you all know the Sustainable Development Goals, and I happen to be on the group of 15 external experts who were invited by the UN Secretary General to produce this Global Sustainable Development Report of 2019, which we entitled The Future is Now. And in this context, we also dealt a lot with sort of the human factor in sustainable development, and not just in terms of avoiding poverty, sort of the human well-being as an end, but also human agency, how more empowered people, empowered through education, empowered through health, can help to achieve global development goals. And we also had this paper here in PNAS where we showed that if indeed the Sustainable Development Goals are being met, which are these different scenarios and different that are below the green area. The green area is the uncertainty range of the UN population projections. But if you sort of go as rapidly in expanding schooling as we assume under the Sustainable Development Goals and also improving reproductive health, then the world population will level off earlier and will be lower altogether. Now, there has also been just a lot of literature to mention, if you want to look it up, that how education really helps to reduce vulnerability to already unavoidable natural disasters or other environmental problems. And we had this review article in Science some time ago, also where we show now with these different SSP scenarios that if we go for the rapid development, SSP 1, for instance, even under increased climate hazards in the future, the number of people potentially dying as a consequence of climate change is significantly reduced as opposed to stalled development. So just in coming to a conclusion, in more generally is that the environment is changing, but the human population is also changing. So when we want to assess what is the vulnerability of the human population, let's say in 2070, we should not only take the climate change, the climate conditions of 2070, and as some agencies unfortunately do it, sort of match it with today's societies, today's public health capabilities. The climate of the future will be met by the society of the future. So we also have to make strong efforts of modeling, forecasting through scenarios, the population of the future, including capabilities, public health capabilities. And for this, the age structure, but also in particular the education structure is very important. And last but not least, about where people live, the urbanization, which I left out here because Martin will deal with this next. So I think I've talked my time and I'll finish here and I'm open for questions. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. That was extremely detailed, very thorough. I know that we're watching the chat box. My quick takeaway is I like how you started by talking about the power of the mighty demographic or some demography. So that's a beautiful description, but it's very powerful. You gave us an insight into things that for people who are not scholars like you to understand the drivers, and you also made us think about our intuition. So you said, for example, some people think GDP drives health outcomes. Your data seems to suggest that it's education. You gave extremely good examples of country level projections. So the Nigeria, you spoke about Korea and Singapore who invested in their education and how that has changed. And then I like the way you brought it back to our central question, which is what does the global future look like in terms of consumption? And so then you brought that back and said, well, actually, pardon me, in terms of consumption patterns, and you linked it beautifully, Professor Lutz, to this inevitable question about climate mitigation and climate adaptation and what that means. So I do want to thank you for, like I say, that storyline that you've woven. I know we're watching the chat. I will abuse my right as the moderator, but you don't have to respond immediately. My question as you were talking was, what do you think will the future age structure look like? So what will the age structure of our population globally look like? So for example, some people say right now, the median age globally is 20, I don't know what it is, or it was 22 in the 70s. What is it now? Why am I asking that? Because I think that does tell us about where we're going in the future. So that's a question from me. I now want to give to our colleague Maria Jose or Hien, who I know is watching the chat, and they will pose 3 questions from our participants.
Hi, good morning. Should I already start with these questions, Marilyn, or do you want to, shall we first go
No,
with
please.
Okay.
No. Like I said, I was abusing my speaker's rights. And we obviously, as the hosts, we give it to our guests and our visitors first.
Yes. Okay. There's a question from Peter Jensen, and it's about the role of religion on fertility rates. He says, are there any studies looking at the role of religion in the population developments, basically? And he gives an example of the Catholic Church has been against contraception, but that has not stopped Italy for having very low fertility rates. And it appears that religion holds more sway over behavior and less educated populations.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. This is indeed a very important question, and actually there is a lot of analysis. In short, religion matters, but mostly through affecting the status of women, not directly the doctrine. And that some people have claimed in the past that, for instance, Muslim fertility is typically higher, which is the case if you look at today's sort of comparing Muslim with Christian or Buddhist countries. But this is sort of our analysis due to a specific religious doctrine. I mean, in the Quran, it says very clearly that couples should have only as many children as they can afford to. There is nothing inherently pronatalist and against family planning. And actually, the one country in the world that had the most rapid fertility decline of any country was not China, it was the Islamic Republic of Iran, where that had really from more than 6-7 children on average in the 1980s going down to today less than 2 children per woman. In the European countries, again, today actually Catholic countries have lower fertility than countries that are predominantly Protestant. But again, this has to do with the status of women, where more Protestant countries had earlier invested in universal education of all girls, and also are therefore further progressed also for women in enabling the combination of having children and being in the part of the workforce. So the summary of the question is, yes, indirectly religion plays a role through the status of women. Directly related to doctrine, it doesn't play much of a role.
Thank you. Maria Jose, any other questions?
Yes, there's one from me, but I will maybe ask another one there's one from Anders Wickman, and he says,
could you group maybe 2 or 3 together?
Yes,
if they are.
Yes, let me see. Yes, so what does make you believe that education in Africa will expand like in South Korea in the coming decades? That's one question. And the other one is, are there gender aspects to the effect of education?
Yes. Well, maybe the first to answer the question, I don't believe that it will particularly happen. The fact is that after 2000, there has been, this was in the context of the Millennium Development Goals, there have been massive efforts in expanding particularly primary education, which was one of the key goals of the Millennium Development Goals. And we see in a large number, a majority of African countries today, that primary education has expanded quite significantly. This has in part also come at the expense of the quality of education. That's a different story. And there is also a danger now that as a consequence of the COVID crisis, where in many countries schools have been closed for almost a year or so, that this expansion is stalled or possibly even reversed. So the future of education in Africa is not at all secured. And we know from past crises, like there was this crisis around the structural adjustment programs of the 1980s, where in some countries school enrollment actually declined because the funding for schooling went down. Then we see that these women, when they came of reproductive age, also the fertility decline stalled. There has been a lot of writing about the stalled African fertility decline around the time of 2000 to 2005. So again, the question is, this is mostly due to women, because it is the women who are sort of primarily making the decision about whether or not they have a child. It's also whether at what age they get married, whether they can fight against being married away already at child age or teenage age. As long as they stay in school, they are not protected against this early marriage, but they also are empowered sort of to better pursue their own interests and also go more actively, more rationally about family planning, deciding how many children they want. So in other words, again, it's really female education that matters more than male. Of course, male is not irrelevant. And secondly, the future education in expansion in Africa, there has been some positive momentum since the beginning of the century, but there's also danger it could be lost. So it's not at all sure that it will follow the Asian pattern.
Thank you. Then I have a couple of related questions here. Well, one was from me. Have you modeled the environmental, social, and economic impacts of specific population policies to either increase or decrease populations? And a related question from Matt says, have the effects of climate change been included in the population estimates, and what are the major effects and concerns?
The relationship between population growth, population trends, and environmental change have indeed been studied, and they're very complex. And maybe I can come back to the chart that I showed. That the question, as you phrased it now, mostly focuses on the mitigation side, like what is the effect of the increasing size of the human population on greenhouse gas emissions. And there has been a famous equation, sort of the IPAD equation. It's called that the impact on the environment equals population times affluence times technology. So in other words, if population growth is the same, but you have a more efficient technology that reduces the impact. If people are getting richer and consume more, the same number of people will have a stronger negative impact on the environment. So it's these three forces that play together to result in a certain environmental impact. And yes, again, it's as I said, it really matters a lot also what is the human capital, what is the abilities of people, not only to sort of come up with greener technologies or induced changes in behavior. So in that sense, it turned out to be not a very meaningful question, sort of what is the isolated impact just of more or fewer human numbers on the environment, because it depends really what these people are doing, how they are behaving, what technology they use. Where numbers may be even more important is on the other way side, on the vulnerability, because there it is sort of the entitlements. If the world population would say like only half in one scenario as compared to another scenario, then of course in a way every citizen of the planet would have twice the entitlement for greenhouse gas emissions and so on. So in that sense, sort of the effects, the negative effects of climate change or other resource scarcity is easier to cope with if there are fewer people, and if these fewer people are more empowered cognitively and economically and socially to cope with this change, than if there would be a very large number of vulnerable people. Maybe I can also at this point also mention, go to the aging issue that has been asked by Marilyn right at the beginning, because reducing population growth inevitably comes together with population aging. Unless you reduce population growth through increasing mortality, but that is not desirable. I mean, that's happened in the past. The population growth was reduced to wars or through famines, where people died in large numbers, and therefore the population declined. And such populations were not necessarily getting older. But if it is sort of a benign, voluntary reduction of population growth, it only goes through a voluntary reduction in the birth rates. And that means that the population pyramid is getting more narrow at the bottom. And as we fortunately see, life expectancy increasing, and there are good reasons to hope that even after the COVID crisis, life expectancy will continue to increase on its previous path. Then the population structure gets older, which in itself is also not such a problem. It can be a problem to certain institutional settings like pension systems that allow people to retire at a relatively early age. And then if, let's say, the age is 60 or in some countries even 55, now if the number of people above age 60 who are all entitled to pension payments increases rapidly, and the number of people who contribute to the pension system shrinks at the same time, then there is a problem of redistribution. But there are many flexible solutions. First of all, people are not only living longer, but they're also living longer in good health, and are therefore able to work longer, and they're increasingly also willing to work longer, because the better educated people also find the jobs more interesting. And you see this, there are many university professors who just don't want to retire at all. They are so enthusiastic, but not all of the jobs are as interesting as those of academics. But increasingly, I think in the future, we will have these more interesting jobs and people will voluntarily work longer. And then there is the technological change also, where there are significant fears that the automation, machine learning, robots will take away the jobs from the young people. And in that context also, it may be actually a good thing that we have fewer people at the younger working ages who to avoid mass unemployment among them if the jobs are increasingly done by robots. But these fewer people need then to be better trained, better educated, to be the ones who program these robots and benefit from it. And still productivity could, through technological change, be increased to compensate for the smaller number of young people. This is, again, it's a very complex topic and much is written, but I just tried to summarize the key aspects of it.
Thank you. I have another question, and a comment from Heinz Schandl. He says, fantastic presentation, and he likes the positive outlook of a world with more educated, smaller populations. But he asks, what do you think can go wrong?
Many things can go wrong, as always, but if you follow this reasoning that I gave, it's the thing that can mostly go wrong is if countries stop investing into education, and also not only at the formal education, but also really look at the skills that people get. We recently published an article where we not looked beyond sort of educational attainment, like whether you were formally sort of graduated from high school. If there are then tests, just simple reading tests showing a sentence and then asking questions to test whether young people understood this sentence. Even people who both had sort of high school graduation in some countries, they were twice as good as in another country. So there is really an increasing focus needs to be on the quality of education. And another thing has been very clearly demonstrated by past studies is that early childhood education is really key. And it's not just the formal education like in kindergarten or so, but from the first day of life, our human brain needs stimulation. It needs emotional stability and relationship stability, but also it needs cognitive challenges. It needs to be fostered. And some of you may know the analysis of James Heckman, the Nobel laureate in economics, who said that every dollar invested in young children pays off much more than the same dollar invested later in education. So I think we have to have a view away from sort of the formal, just looking at organized schooling, but look at the childhood development from the earliest ages and then not stop. I mean, increasingly as technologies change and we are capable of further learning throughout our life, this needs to be followed by lifelong learning up to very high ages. And there are indications that even sort of healthy aging at the age of 80 and above really depends on how cognitively active people are, whether it could be like my own mother still doing crossword puzzles or Sudoku at her high age of almost 90. This keeps you alive and keeps you also more actively engaged in your society.
Thank you. And there's a follow-up question from Heinz on that same line. He says, we see an increasing inequality in many countries, and will this not negatively impact educational attendance?
Yes, there is indeed. I mean, it's a question of how you measure inequality. Mostly it's only income inequality, which I rather tend to see as an outcome of deeper inequalities in education opportunities and development opportunities. Just spraying money from the helicopter will not solve this problem. It's more sort of investing in the, as I said, the cognitive and emotional development of children and then throughout the human life course. So that is, I think, the way to go. And inequality, also there's ethnic and racial inequality. And of course, there's overwhelming evidence that societies that have less inequality also have not only economically better, but also have higher life satisfaction. They have better institutions. They are more peaceful. And actually, in any respect, such societies are preferable to highly divided societies.
Thank you. Merlin, are you able to speak now or no? I know for some reason Merlin can't unmute herself. Just wanted to note that. But there are, speaking of gender equality, there are a couple of questions that we've received talking about, well, one is from Arthur Eis from the Netherlands asking, well, in Europe, young women tend to be better educated than men. What are the demographic consequences of that? And an estimated 200 women have expressed they want access to contraceptives but are deprived of it. How can that be changed? Why are Western governments not doing more? That is from, I believe, that came from Anders.
Yes, I mean, that is true that in many highly developed countries, the young women tend to have a better formal education than men, and it's, yeah, they often have a sort of, also in school, there's sort of the ways the school are organized in many countries. It's in a way, boys have more disciplinary problems. They drop out more easily. They always want to be, not all of them, but some more on the applied side. That's why we still have many more boys in sort of more technical oriented schools than girls, and girls tend to be more willing to invest sort of in reading a lot, which is something that boys don't like. So there are some gender differences, I think, through the early childhood development that also result in some of these effects. Now the question is, how does this affect the fertility? And this really depends on culture. There are, like Korea, as I'd mentioned, that has an extremely low fertility these days. They had already before the corona pandemic only 0.8 children per woman. Just to remind you, it's about 2 children per woman to keep a population roughly constant at its current level. If 0.8, it falls below 1, that has almost never happened in the past. And now the most recent information is that through COVID, it's yet another 10% lower. What is there? Well, in Korea, women are, as I showed, extremely well educated, but they don't want to marry down, as you say. They don't want to marry less educated men. In Europe, it's not that strong. I mean, the formal education, whether you, since everybody has sort of people with, whether you have a university degree as opposed to sort of a more applied college degree for a man, that doesn't make such a difference. But particularly under rather conservative family systems as you have it in Korea, where all the women are expected to stay home if they marry and look after the children. More highly educated women, they don't want to marry a less educated man who still may have these conservative family norms and give up their own career. So in these more conservative family systems, and that's also the reason why in Southern Europe, Italy, Spain, and Greece to some extent, you have a much lower fertility rate than in Northern Europe, because their women have to make a choice. Highly educated women have to make a choice. Either I pursue my own professional career, but then the women cannot follow the traditional family mother type, which expects them to be at home and mostly look after children. And that is part of the reason that more and more women choose their career, that they have so low birth rates in these countries. But the Nordic countries in particular, but also in France and increasingly some other Central European countries, there are good examples of how social policies of the government can help women to combine their own professional careers with having a family.
Thank you. Marilyn, I think you can speak now. Good.
Yes, I can. Somebody muted me, but I'm not going to take it personally, Professor Lutz. Coming back to my question, because I think that's a way to close this conversation, because we're almost at the hour. If you recall, my question was, what will the age structure of our population, so the median, if you like, look like in the future? Why am I asking that question? I'm asking that question to understand if it's the 20s and the 30-year-olds, if that is the age structure right now, I don't know, that's going to drive change in terms of consumption. So you see, I want to bring back your wonderful presentation to our big picture question, which is, what does the global future look like in terms of managing our natural resources? And you've laid out very clearly the trends in terms of demographics, who's getting old, which populations have a good chance of mimicking what's happening in Europe or other parts of the world, etc. But I want you to help us close this link. And I think Maria Jose also asked this question, to bring it back to the central concern of the International Resources Panel. So I'm going to leave that with you. If you can quickly give us 2 or 3 minutes, and then we'll hand over to our next speaker. Thanks, Professor Lutz.
Thank you very much. Yes, you're quite right. When I addressed the issue of aging before, I did it in the more conventional way of looking at the economic consequences, the consequences for social security system, that you have more retired people, again, contributors. But as you rightly pointed out in your intervention now, it is also very relevant for the changing behavior and environmental protection and relating to the resources. And there's sort of this, initially I talked about this model of demographic metabolism, so the renewal of generations. And of course, if people live longer and there's more aging, this metabolism is sort of slowed down. The people with their given values are staying around for longer, and there's less turnover from the young people who presumably have new values and are more ready to change their behavior. And some people are rather pessimistic on that, but it all depends how you expect that people are still flexible to, over the life course, change their views and change their mindsets. And this brings us back again to, in a way, the cognitive level and the education. It's very clearly that people who from the beginning have a better education, they are also more accepting to learn and change their views later on if they are convinced by evidence that it's indeed necessary. And as I mentioned, this lifelong learning is an important aspect. And the good news is that increasingly people who have started their lives with learning more also continue to learn more throughout their lives. And I could conclude with the German National Academy of Sciences, Leopoldina. We had, in the context of this Global Sustainable Development Report, a series of symposia. We called it Brain Power for Sustainable Development, but essentially it looked at the cognitive preconditions for behavioral change that will help to bring about sustainable development. So it's because the problem is in climate change in many of these fields, these are just abstract models. We cannot smell the CO2, we cannot see it, but we need to believe in the scientific models that tell us that indeed this poses a danger for the future of ourselves and the coming generation. And I'm optimistic that this will also convince people who may be dying over the next decades and not experiencing anymore the worst of climate change to come, that they will understand this and also have solidarity with the younger generations that still will experience this. I think I'll stop at this point. Thank you.
That's a very, very good way to conclude our discussion, Professor Lutz. And all I can do is thank you on behalf of the IRP Secretariat for a thorough, well-prepared, extremely in-depth. I can tell from the questions in the chat that you've made people think not just about the relationship on populations and demography and environmental issues, but also about our own sense of what's going to happen to us, right? So now I know that if I want to live to 90, I'm going to have to, as you said, imitate your mother and learn how to do puzzles and play Sudoku. And that was my big takeaway, selfishly. But more seriously, very good food for thought. I think this is going to help us as the IRP to ask those questions as we go into our global resources outlook for 2023